Good day. In this third video about the increase of the executive power, where in the first video we've looked at the context of Namibia and then the increase of the executive in the world with reference to COVID-19 and the World Economic Forum at the World Health Organization. The second video we've looked specific at the increase of the presidential power in Namibia at the cost of the legislative and judiciary. In this third video, we are also focusing on the increase of the executive power, but this time we will specifically look at the increase of other forms of executive power in Namibia with reference to ministers and legislation related to the powers of ministers. Now, if we look at the Marine Resources Act that enabled the facilitation of the fish rot scandal by the former Minister of Fisheries, Mr. Bernard Esau, and the former Minister of Justice, that also was a former Attorney General, that abused their power to shoehorn in position the Marine Resources Act of Namibia in order to make provision for a unilateral discretionary allocation of a quota by the Minister of Fisheries that increased the executive power of the Minister of Fisheries in order to the specific fish court company that abused their position to also bribe and gave a huge part of the quota to the Icelandic company Samherji. That specific legislation that contributed to the fish rot scandal that have been exposed and whistleblowed by Mr. Johannes Stefansson, about which I've written an extensive article about in the Namibian Journal of Science, where I've explained this whole position about the Marine Resources Act is an example, one example where such corruption been facilitated legitimately by ministers that's currently in custody awaiting trial since November 2020, if I'm correct. These more serious implication to that is that this fish rot scandal, the biggest scandal in terms of corruption ever been exposed in Namibia, where the ruling parties also being involved, given the money being channeled through lawyers like Mr. Marine de Klerk, that recently also changed his name and is still a fugitive in South Africa, and allegedly also a prominent lawyer that has been appointed by the late president as part of the Politburo that have a law firm in Namibia. They didn't want to disclose his and contravene his client confidentiality in terms of the channeling of funds through his trust fund for the buying of properties, and because the law society has been compromised, there are serious allegations with high probability of truth that the ruling party have received actually funds from the fish rot scandal for the campaigning and of the previous election that took place in 2014, 2015, where the late President Hage Geingob have been appointed as the presidential candidate during that ruling party conference. Now, that legislation that enabled that have not been changed to date. That means that this increase of the executive power to make such a discretion possible by the Minister of Fisheries to allocate a quota unchallenged and not based on any criteria of merit or explanation. And that is not only a quota to the Fish Corps, but also fish quotas to many different other fishing companies in which black empowerment companies are being represented based on a preferential ruling party basis, have not been changed, and that is a serious reversal on the checks and balances in our executive system that needs to be addressed. Then, if we look also at the Investment Promotion Act that are being passed in Parliament, where recently, in 2024, where the Minister of Trade and Industry have the discretion to take up to 274 days to make a decision about shareholding, changes in shareholding, and to decide on if an investor wants to invest in Namibia, to decide yeah or nay about such a decision. 274 days. Which investor will be able to wait so long? That means also an extensive increase of power to such a Minister of Trade and Industry. That is a prime example of the increase of executive power with reference to ministers specific allowed by legislation. Then the also Regulation 28 of the Pension Fund Act that have been that made provision that 45% of all pension fund and insurance funds in Namibia must be invested in the country, limit the return on investment by trying to keep investment and money in the country available for government spending, because borrowing foreign in any of the 5 dominated currencies makes it very expensive. So that is another example of increase of executive power. Then also in terms of the hydrogen tender that have been awarded on a preferred bidder status to Africa, Energy, a conglomerate of 3 companies that existed only 6 months without even proclaiming the reasons why a preferred bidder status was awarded, and handled only by the State House under huge secrecy, and bypassing the Public Procurement Act that state that within, I think, 10 or 11 days such information should be made available. It has not been made available now for almost 2 years. It's also a well-known fact from newspapers that the hydrogen tender that has in the meantime also been awarded to Africa, that the pilot status of the 3 pilot projects have not been completed, but the tender has been awarded already and the tender was handled completely by the State House, not involving the Public Procurement Act regulations, not involving the Ministry of Mines and Energy, and not involving the Parliamentary Committee on Natural Resources. Now, that is another example of an increase of executive power in terms of tendering without checks and balances that must be addressed, and that cannot be continued like this. The excuse that the State House give and the Hydrogen Commissioner that company secrets could have been revealed if reasons being provided is not accepted by the public or by the Institute of Public Policy Research for that matter, because you don't have to reveal the company's secret and just basically provide the reasons why the company received a preferred bidder status and then a bidder status. Now, this tender is the biggest in the history of Namibia, involving about 200 billion Namibian dollars, of which Namibia will invest 24 billion in some other form that will bind the current and the future generation into payback, while at the same time hydrogen can be possible in Namibia, but definitely not the building of an extensive pipeline through the desert from Lüderitz to Walvis Bay through a highly sensitive ecosystem with high temperature, with a toxic gas that cannot be smelled and highly flammable at, I think, 475 degrees Fahrenheit, while Namibia doesn't have the capacity or the experience or the track record of maintaining such infrastructure. Now, because of those reasons given, it is of a great concern and should be a great concern to the youth of Namibia that are perceivably looking forward to these to this huge investment. That is understandable, but the practicality of that and the fact that it's never been proven in the world a success make it highly suspicious if it can and will be a success. So that is another example of the abuse of executive power directly by the State House in order to keep information confidential. Another form is the Cybercrime Act that allow now the police to tap your phone without a court interdict, and so that checks and balance on the privacy of the person have completely removed, and that's what we call the Cybercrime Act. So all data companies are obliged now in terms of the law to keep records of all your dealings on social media for 5 years, so that if there is some form of suspicion that you are an enemy of the state, to call it that way, or if you say something about a minister that doesn't like, to give instruction to the police to tap your phone, to provide some surveillance, and that can also be abuse the privacy of people. In other countries, it has been done, and Namibia have ignored the European example of using their information that have provided more checks and balances to the system. And it's also proven that in countries where the Cybercrime Act have been implemented and Money Laundering Act have been implemented, that there was not actually a prevention of any of those because of increased government control and surveillance of people, of which China is a great example of these type of events on a daily basis, as well as Singapore in other countries as well. So it's also worthwhile to mention that the Communications the Communications Act Section 6 has been amended to make provision that such information can be kept in terms of for 5 years, and the Communications Regulatory Authority oversee that, the Cybercrime Act, and the Chief Executive Officer of CRAN reports then also to them the Executive Director of the National Intelligence, and that person is supposed to report to the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, but that Parliamentary Committee doesn't exist now for years. So you see that there have been a deterioration of the executive powers that leave serious concerns. Then this is also against the background that they've taken more than 19 years for the Access to Information Act to have to be gazetted in Namibia. Because just after independence, the Prime Minister's office started working on that, and I was also part of Action Namibia, of which Mr. Frederico Links later became also the leader, in which we tried to provide our input in such an act. It's also worthwhile that the Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017, that the regulations are only in the process now of being written 7 years after it's been gazetted, and that gives an indication of the seriousness or the non-seriousness of the executive in order to put checks and balances and to provide incentives and penalties for people to blow the whistle, because the penalty for victimization, as recorded in the Whistleblower Protection Act, that have not been implemented yet because of a so-called lack of funds, and the office has not been in existence yet and in operation. The penalty for that is extensive. I think it's 500,000. That will definitely not encourage people to report and to whistleblow, and it should be the other way around. The minister overseeing the Whistleblower Protection Act will also have the sole discretion to decide if a person needs to be compensated somehow for blowing a whistle. Now, why would a minister allow that to provide an incentive on a discretionary individual basis, case by case, if it is against the ruling party? So that is another problem in terms of the increasing of the executive power. We also can see in terms of the Environmental Protection Act, where the increase of the power of the minister and also the responsible for the Environmental Act, and the also the Environmental Commissioner, and that have not used their powers to expose Recon Africa, for example, that is being paid with Namcor, and 10% deal of Namcor shareholding in Recon Africa that until now haven't found oil after a few oil drills in the Kavango region. After the Woodrot case have taken place, no oil have been found. However, another 12 boreholes have been allowed and granted to Recon Africa to drill, without so much concern about the public's extensive involvement and opposition against the presence of Recon Africa and the destruction of the water, groundwater of the Kavango region. Then also in terms of the Woodrot case, where the famous Mr. Jack Wong, so-called friend of the late president, have been in court about 17, 18 times, but never been arrested, is a clear involvement where business and political connections are more important than checks and balances on the increase of the executive power. It's also a well-known fact that this Mr. Jack Wong, that was responsible for the Woodrot, Rosewood and Mopani and African teak, if I'm correct, out of the country, was also a business partner of the late president that planned an extensive development just east of Windhoek. And thereafter, after negative publicity, the president put that into a blind trust. So there's another example of the increase of executive power, where a president and minister should actually not be involved in business, but that is being allowed in Namibia. And another case is that the public servants are allowed to participate in business in Namibia, and where they can also use the influence and even tender in Namibia. And there was also an article written in a legal journal, into which I've also contributed as part of a peer review of the article, where the focus was how that absence of that checks and balance on allowing public servants to be actively involved in tendering and competing with privileged information, inside information, and competing with the private sector contribute to also to not just moonlighting, but also to involvement and in corruption in Namibia is another example of an increase of the executive power, this time in the form of the presidents of public servants that are allowed to participate in tenders and compete directly with business. Another example is also Namcor, that plan to open 256 power filling stations to compete directly with private filling station owners in Namibia, while Namcor is supposed to be a regulator. And this has been addressed in another series in terms of, does public-private enterprises have, their boards have what it takes? So it's hopefully very clear that the increase of executive power is not just limited to the president, but also increases to the power of ministers, provided in terms of the extensive discretion in legislation, in a number of examples that I've used. And in the next video, I will also look at other legislation to prove the point of the increase of executive power as a major trend in Namibia, and then within the context globally of COVID-19 and World Economic Forum that I've provided already.